So last class, we looked at how to solve a quadratic equation by graphing. Today, we're going to look at a different way of solving, which is solving by factoring. Altogether in this class, we're going to look at 3 different ways that you can solve a quadratic equation. We already did one, graphing. Today, we're going to do factoring, and then later we're going to do the quadratic formula. That'll be our third method. But for today, we're going to solve by factoring. So solving a quadratic means finding the x-intercepts. So finding the x-intercepts, which is always where y equals 0. So anytime you have an x-intercept, and we looked at this when we looked at how to find an x-intercept, right? Whenever you have an x-intercept, it's always a point where the y-coordinate is 0, okay? So that's what we're looking for. So we're looking for points where the y-coordinate equals 0. So we're going to use that to kind of help us solve. What we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our equation equals 0. Instead of equaling y, we want it to equal 0. Okay, so step 1 is going to be make sure that the equation, equals 0. Then we're going to factor it just like how we learned to do last unit with the boxes. And then we're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve from there. All right, so let's take a look at this first example. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure it equals 0, which it does, so great. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to factor this using our lovely little box, right? So remember, first thing goes in the first box, last thing goes in the last box. And then I need to find 2 things that multiply to -5 and add to 4. So I'm going to make a little list over here. Things that multiply to -5. So 1 and -5, or -1 and +5. That's it. It's a pretty short list for this one. Remember, one has to be negative, the other has to be positive to make a multiply of negative. Okay, so I need which pair adds up to +4? Well, in this case, it would be these 2. So in my box, I'm going to put -1x and I'm going to put 5x. And then we just have to figure out what goes in the outside of the box. So what has to go here and here so they multiply to x squared? Well, just x and x. What has to go here so that when I multiply it by x, I get -1x? Just -1. And what has to go here so when I multiply it by x, I get 5x? 5. So my factored form of this equation is x plus 5 times x minus 1. And then I'm just going to throw on, since this equals 0, I'm going to make this equal to 0. All right, so we got it factored. Step 2 done. So step 3, we're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So this is using something called the zero product property. I think it's a really silly property to have like a fancy name, but it basically just says that when you multiply 2 things together and the answer is 0, then one of the 2 things has to be 0. Okay, so I'm going to say it again. So if you multiply 2 things together and the answer is 0, then one of those 2 things has to be 0. Okay, and that should make sense because the only time you ever get 0 as an answer when you multiply is if you multiply by 0, right? Anytime you multiply something by 0, you get 0 as the answer. And that's the only time that happens. Okay, so that's what the zero product property says. So what we have here is we have a thing multiplied by another thing, and the answer is 0. So the zero product property tells me that either this thing has to equal 0 or this thing has to equal 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, what value of x makes x plus 5 equal 0? And what value of x makes x minus 1 equal 0? And I'm going to solve these 2 equations. Really quick, easy solve. Subtract 5 from both sides. This one, add 1 on both sides. X is +1. And these are my 2 solutions. X equals -5 or x equals 1. Okay, so this isn't anything too crazy. We've done this before, right? We've done this part before, and we've done this part before. So it's just kind of putting them together. All right, now quick side note. What do these 2 solutions mean in terms of your graph? So what this tells me is that if I were to graph this graph is going to go through -5 on the x-axis and +1 on the x-axis. I don't really know exactly what the rest of it's going to look like, but it's going to do something like that. Okay, so these 2 answers and these 2 answers, they're the same thing. They connect together. All right, let's do the next example. So again, this one equals 0. This one that equals 0 is at the end. This time it was at the beginning. Doesn't make a difference at all. So it's already equal to 0, so we're all set with that. So we're going to factor. Okay, so first thing goes in the first box, last thing goes in the last box. And I need two things that multiply to 2 and add to -3. So things that multiply to 2, 1 times 2. And then be careful, the one that gets overlooked the most, -1 and -2, also multiply to +2. And in this case, that's the pair that I need to get them to add to -3. So I'm going to put -1x and -2x in my boxes. All right, what goes here? So they multiply to x squared, x and x. What goes here? So when I multiply it by x, I get -1x, -1. What goes here? So when I multiply by x, I get -2x, -2. So my factored form is x minus 2 times x minus 1. And I'm going to put this equals 0 at the end because it was at the end for this one, but it doesn't matter. You could have put it at the beginning like on this one. It doesn't make a difference. All right, so we got it factored. So now our zero product property that says that either the first thing has to equal 0 or the second thing has to equal 0. And I'm going to solve these two baby equations. X equals +2, x equals 1. And those are my two answers for this quadratic. What would the graph look like? Well, the graph is going to go through 2 and 1. So this is a really skinny parabola. It's going to do something like that. And those are the two spots that it goes through on the x-axis. All right, one more. Now, the piece that's different about this one is that this time it's not equal to 0. So not a big deal. Our first move is going to be to make it equal 0. So I'm going to start by adding the 9 on both sides and canceling that out so that it equals 0 now. Okay, and then on this side, you just want to make sure that you write your answer in standard form. So remember, standard form means that the thing with the highest exponent goes first, then the things with the next highest exponent, and anything without any variables goes at the end, right? Okay, so now we're going to factor that. So here's my box. X squared, +9. I need two things that multiply to 9 and add to 6. So 1 and 9, 3 and 3, -1, -9, -3, -3. So which of those add to 6? These guys. So I'm going to put a 3x here and a 3x here. And then along the outside of the box, these are going to have to both be x's. That's going to be a 3, so that they'll multiply to 3x. That's also going to be 3, so they'll multiply to 3x. So when I factor this, it factors to x plus 3 times x plus 3. And it equaled 0. Again, doesn't matter if you put the equal 0 here or here, it's the same thing. All right, so to finish this off, I have to set each one of these equal to 0 and then solve them. So with these two, they actually end up being the same equation, which means that you actually get the same answer. So you get the same answer twice. So really it's only like having one answer. So in terms of what your graph would look like for this one, what that tells me is that this graph is going to come and hit at -3 on the x-axis, and then it bounces back up and keeps going. So there's only this one point right here. This guy has one solution because we only ended up with the same answer twice. Okay, so that's an example of how you'll see one solution show up. When you're factoring, you can't use that to figure out if there's no solutions. Factoring doesn't give you that information. It just tells you if you have one solution or two solutions, and kind of only sometimes, because it doesn't always work. Okay, so this is a method for solving equations. Solving by graphing is really, really easy if you have the graph. If you don't have the graph and the thing that you have factors, then this is usually the fastest way to solve and try to find those spots where your graph crosses the x-axis.